Bill Maher, known for his provocative remarks and sharp tongue, unexpectedly ordered the arrest of Keanu Reeves live on his show. It all started as a joke, but when the camera switched to Reeves, people in black suits approached him and handcuffed him. An instant silence fell over the studio. Was this part of the show or a real threat? With each passing second, the tension mounted, and the audience was left in utter confusion, trying to understand what was actually happening. Sit back and relax because I'm about to tell you the story. But before we dive into it, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. By doing so, you'll stay updated on the most interesting stories from Keanu's life. Bill Maher sat at his show's desk, as confident as ever and ready to provoke. This time, his jokes were sharper than usual. He looked at Keanu Reeves, who was sitting opposite him, smiling. And in the most unexpected moment, Bill, with a wide grin, said, "Keanu, you're under arrest." At first, everyone thought it was just a joke. But when the camera switched to Reeves, two men in black suits quickly approached him and handcuffed him. The entire studio froze in silence. The viewers didn't know what was going on, while Keanu simply looked at Bill, his face remaining calm. What was Bill's goal, and what was behind this unexpected turn of events? After Bill Maher announced that Keanu Reeves had been arrested, the studio froze in silence for a moment. At first, everyone thought it was just part of the script, nothing more. But when the camera switched to Keanu, the studio viewers were stunned. Two men in black suits, clearly prepared, approached him and handcuffed him. Keanu, without resisting, stood up and was escorted to the exit. The noise in the studio began to rise, but Bill, seemingly oblivious to what was happening, tried to continue the show. "This isn't what you think," he said, though his voice didn't sound as confident as usual. The viewers started whispering, wondering what was going on. Where was the joke, and where was the reality? And just when Keanu was about to leave the studio, the camera caught his glance, full of confusion and anxiety. In that moment, Bill felt that everything he had done might spiral out of control. What role did Keanu play in this drama? Once the broadcast ended, the studio filled with confusion. Bill stood by his desk trying to gather his thoughts, but the team was lost. The cameraman was checking the cameras in disbelief, and the producer approached Bill, clearly concerned about the situation. "Did you know about this?" the producer asked, unable to hide the anxiety in his voice. "Know what?" Bill responded almost automatically, but doubts began to form within him. This didn't look like an ordinary joke. The cameras were still rolling, and the studio audience was still watching, trying to make sense of what was happening. Soon, Bill received a call. "You need to figure out what's going on with Keanu. This isn't just a show anymore. This is something else," said the voice on the other end of the line. It was one of his old contacts from law enforcement. This person's words confirmed that the situation had escalated beyond a typical television stunt. Keanu Reeves was involved in something much larger than it seemed. Bill found himself in the center of the action, and his joke, which was supposed to be just another provocation, had suddenly led to the unimaginable. Who was behind this arrest, and why had Keanu become the target? After the broadcast, Bill couldn't calm down. He couldn't believe that his own program had led to such a situation. The next day, after learning that Keanu had been detained and taken away by unknown individuals, Bill decided he had to personally investigate what was happening. Instead of continuing with his usual work, he headed to the place where, he found out, Keanu had last been seen. "I need to find the answers," he tells himself as he walks past the cameras, ready to track his every move again. He decides to meet with a few acquaintances to find out more about what was happening behind the scenes of the show. Every word, every name he heard led to an increasingly dangerous theory, where the television show seemed like just a small link in a chain of much more complex and darker dealings. Who is behind this mystery, and why did Keanu need to be arrested? And most importantly, why is all of this connected to Bill Maher? Soon it became clear the situation was far more complicated than he had thought. Bill realized that this was not just a coincidence, but a carefully planned operation. Keanu was involved in a case that included people from all layers of society, from politicians to high-profile businessmen. And even more troubling, Bill had been drawn into this from the very beginning. He decided he had to learn more before deciding how to act. Bill's joke had turned into a trap, one that he himself had fallen into. The more he dug, the clearer it became that Maher had become part of this dark game. Bill felt like his career might be over. Now he wasn't just the host, he was an active participant in this dangerous game. He was on the verge of uncovering a secret that could not only ruin his life, but the lives of everyone around him. The morning after Bill Maher sentenced Keanu Reeves to arrest on live TV, he sat in his office, nervously flipping through papers and reviewing notes. Everything that had happened at that moment wouldn't let him rest. It seemed the joke he had so skillfully delivered had suddenly spiraled out of control. Everything had gone wrong, far from what he had planned. From the moment Keanu was taken away, Bill couldn't let it go. This is more than just a show, he thought, staring at his empty coffee cup. His mind was filled with questions. Why was Keanu the target? Who was behind this? Was this just a prank, or was there a larger game at play? His office was silent. He closed his eyes, sinking into the memories of what had happened. It all started as a fun joke, but Keanu, he wasn't just a regular guest on the show, he was something more. And now he was gone. Bill didn't know what to do. At first, he tried calling his producer, but there was no answer. Bill realized the situation was slipping out of his control. He stood up from his chair, deciding he couldn't sit idly by. He had to find Keanu, figure out what was happening to him, and why he was arrested. As soon as he stepped out of his office, his gaze landed on his phone. He noticed a new message. It was from an unknown number. The message was only a few lines. "You've started something bigger than just a joke, Bill. We're watching you. You're not alone. Find me if you want to know the truth." Bill felt a chill run down his spine. Who could this be? And what did it mean? He didn't know exactly what to search for, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just sit idly by anymore. He immediately decided that there had to be one place where he could find answers. Keanu's office. He knew he hadn't been there in a while, but this was his only chance to figure out what was going on. Keanu was a person who had never been at the center of loud scandals. He had always stayed in the shadows. Why had he been arrested now, and what were the people behind this hiding? Bill stepped outside with only one thought in his mind: find Keanu. But as soon as he got into his car, his phone rang again. He looked at the screen and saw a number he recognized. It was his old acquaintance, Police Officer John Matthews. Bill dialed John's number and he picked up immediately. "Bill, you need to stop. You're in danger," John said, his voice tense. "I know you're looking for Keanu, but this is no longer just a joke. This is much more complicated. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." "I won't stop, John. I have to find him," Bill replied, his voice full of determination. "You don't understand what they can do to you. This is a game you can't stop playing. You've been part of it. And trust me, they're watching your every move. Do you want to stay alive?" John fell silent, as if gathering his thoughts. "I can help you, but if you don't stop, I won't be able to protect you." Bill felt the weight in his chest as his breathing became heavier. John's words sounded like a warning, and everything in his mind changed. He knew he had to act fast, but now he understood that in this game, he might not have a second chance. "Where is he?" Bill asked, trying not to let John avoid the question. But John was silent for a few seconds, and then Bill realized that the question about Keanu wasn't just about the truth. It was about his life. The next morning, Bill met John in a secluded cafe. where they had always exchanged information. John looked tired, his eyes filled with worry. He already knew that Bill wouldn't stop. They started talking about what had been happening behind the scenes of Keanu's arrest and how it all connected to high-profile people in society. "You don't know who's behind this, Bill, but I do. These people can destroy you if you keep going like this. They're so influential you can't even imagine what you're up against," John said, looking at Bill with a worried expression. "You're going all the way, but you have to understand this. Your life is on the line now. Do you want to keep going?" "I can't back down, John," Bill replied firmly. "I don't know what these people are hiding, but I'll find out." John nodded silently, but Bill saw his hands ball into fists. John knew that it might be too late to stop what was happening, but he couldn't leave Bill alone in this game. Bill and John stood outside the old cafe, trying to figure out what to do next. The atmosphere was thick with anxiety. Neither of them knew what the next step should be, but both understood. Everything depended on this. John handed Bill a city map which marked several locations linked to possible criminal networks. This was the beginning of their path, but Bill already knew that his life and reputation were in danger. "We need to get to one of these warehouses. There's evidence there that could prove what's happening behind the scenes." "It's the key," John said, pointing to a mark on the map. His voice was confident, but Bill could see the fear still in his eyes. He was tense, but he knew. They couldn't hesitate now. They arranged to meet in a few hours at the entrance of one of these warehouses. It wasn't just about Keanu. This was much more important. Bill knew that they could face people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. When Bill stepped out of the cafe, his gaze accidentally caught the glowing screen of his phone. A message from an unknown number appeared. "They're already watching you. You don't have much time." Time was ticking fast and the tension was rising with every moment. Bill and John met at the designated spot and soon found themselves at the warehouse door. But things didn't go as planned. When they approached the entrance, Bill noticed that the doors were different from usual. They were locked, but it was clear that someone was inside. This was strange, and Bill felt his heart beat faster. "Something's wrong," Bill whispered, hiding his face behind dark sunglasses to avoid being recognized. John nodded, also feeling the tension. They stood in the shadows, evaluating the situation. Suddenly, a shadow flickered in the warehouse window. Someone was inside. But who? And what did they want? "We need to get inside before we're spotted," John said, checking the weapon they brought just in case. Bill looked carefully at the door. His intuition told him that they weren't alone, and this could be a trap. They decided to act fast. But as soon as they stepped inside, the doors slammed shut behind them with a loud bang, and the light inside flickered out. In the next moment, footsteps echoed through the room. It was a trap, and they had fallen into it. When the light turned back on, Bill saw several people in dark suits standing in front of them. Their faces were hidden behind masks, but Bill could feel that these people were professionals. Without a word, they surrounded Bill and John. One of the men stood directly in front of them. "We knew you'd fall into our hands sooner or later," he said with icy certainty. His voice left no doubt. He knew who they were. These were not just guards. They were people willing to do anything to protect the secrets of the criminal network. Bill felt his heart racing, but he showed no fear. He knew he had no choice but to fight. But against such a number of people and with such limited resources, they could hardly win. "I don't think you want to keep playing this game, Bill," said the second man. "It's time to stop." Bill froze. This was no mere threat. They might be ready to kill them right here, right now. He and John were trapped, and their chances of escape were quickly dwindling. What had felt like an eternity was now moving faster. Bill and John started retreating, but more guards appeared in their path, blocking all exits. They couldn't back down, and only a few seconds remained before everything would be over. Bill understood that if they didn't find a way out, they'd be captured, and all they knew about the criminal network would be lost. He quickly turned to John and whispered, "Let's go, we have to break through." But before they could move, one of the guards raised his hand, signaling the others to stop. "Wait," he said, and everyone froze. "There's a chance they can lead us to something big." Before Bill and John could respond, confusion spread among the guards. What exactly were they hiding? The more Bill tried to understand, the more he felt that this was turning into a dangerous game. Bill and John stood face to face with guards who were armed to the teeth. The silence around them was deafening, and the air was thick with threat. Bill felt his heart racing, but he didn't let himself lose composure. John, standing beside him, was also alert, but his eyes reflected uncertainty. He didn't know what would happen, but he was ready to act based on the situation. "What do you want from us?" Bill asked, trying to take the situation to a new level. He didn't know who was standing before them, but he understood one thing. These people were not ordinary guards. Their reaction to any action would be ruthless and decisive. One of the masked guards raised his hand, signaling that he was ready to speak. He stepped forward and said, "We don't want to fight with you, Maher. We understand that you're searching for the truth, but if you don't leave this investigation alone, we will be forced to take action." Bill felt his jaw tighten. He knew they weren't playing by his rules, but he had no choice but to keep going. He couldn't back down. "Can I talk to the one in charge?" Bill asked. He felt this could be his chance to get some information and possibly find a way out of this trap. The guard silently nodded and gestured. Less than a minute later, a man appeared before them who looked like the leader of the entire operation. It was the same police officer Bill had encountered several times before. His face was grim and serious, and his eyes held an undeniable threat, one with no way out. The leader of the guards, a tall and imposing man, stood before them without showing any sign of concern. Bill felt the tension in the air grow. This moment was critical. If he made a mistake, it would be the end. He glanced at John, who subtly nodded. Clearly, they both understood. They had no other choice. "You shouldn't have interfered, Bill," the man said. His voice was calm, but there was power in it. "We've been watching you. You've come too close. Do you think all these events were coincidences? You're wrong. We've known you'd start digging. Who are you?" Bill knew his question was crucial. He needed to find out who was behind this criminal network and who he would have to face next. The man didn't respond immediately. He silently studied Bill as if assessing him. "We are the system," he finally said. "You, like everyone else, have become a part of this world, and like everyone else, you're subject to these rules. If you only knew how many people give their lives for these games." At that moment, Bill realized an unimaginable truth. Everything he had been trying to destroy was part of something much bigger than just a criminal network. It was part of the system that controlled everything. He felt his world crumbling. But what should he do next? The man continued speaking, his words falling on Bill and John like heavy stones. He didn't hide the fact that they were in serious danger. Bill knew he needed to be careful with every word. He couldn't afford a mistake. "You, Bill, have learned too much. You should have understood that this won't end here. And if you think your efforts will break the system, you're gravely mistaken. We control not only you, but everything around you." Bill stared at him, his mind racing with these words, trying to understand what exactly was happening. He felt his life changing with every word, every move. What had once seemed like a game now turned into a deadly risk. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Bill said, trying to regain control. He knew he had to play his card, make a move forward, even if it meant taking a risk. At that moment, one of the guards approached and whispered in the leader's ear that something was wrong outside. He looked concerned, and his words made Bill tense up. "We need to leave," the leader said, turning his attention to Bill and John. But you know this won't end here. You've sold your soul, Maher, and now you must be ready for the consequences." Bill felt a tightness in his chest. The situation was worsening by the second, and he began to understand that they were in a deadly trap. But worst of all, it wasn't just a knife hanging over their heads. It was a game where they had all become pawns. "You must understand you're already lost," the man continued. "We won't give you a chance to leave. All your actions and attempts to expose us, that's your mistake." But at that moment, Bill made a decision. He was ready for the final step. "I'll keep fighting anyway," he said, his gaze growing resolute. "You can close your eyes, but it won't stop me. You won't be able to manipulate people like you did before." Bill and John, now deep in the bowels of this game, understood that their task was no longer just to survive. They had to destroy the system, tear it down from the inside, and they were ready to pay a high price for it. Bill and John hid in the basement, in a secluded spot away from prying eyes. The atmosphere was filled with anxiety and tension. In the last few hours, everything around them had changed. Now they weren't just fighting for their lives, they were trying to expose a criminal network that spanned the highest levels of power. They were up against not just a group of criminals, but a system entwined with governmental structures, which made their fight not only dangerous, but nearly hopeless. "Time is running out," John said, scanning the silent basement with his eyes. "You know that if we don't act quickly, they'll just destroy us." Bill didn't respond immediately. He could feel his body tense up, and his mind was overwhelmed with thoughts. He had been through so many trials, but now when they were so close to uncovering the truth, it seemed that the stakes were higher than ever. Someone was watching them, and every step they took could now be their last. "We can't keep hiding," Bill finally said. "If we don't make a decisive move right now, this will be the end." John sighed, looking at Bill. His face was drawn, but there was a determination in his eyes. "I'm ready, but we need to find their weak spots. We can't just barge in and hope for the best." But as soon as John said those words, they heard a noise behind the wall. Someone was approaching, and it seemed like they were one step away from being discovered. Suddenly, the basement door creaked. Bill and John quickly got to their feet, preparing for whatever might come. The tension in their eyes was impossible to hide. Someone opened the door and stepped into the dark corridor. Bill grabbed the weapon they had brought with them and took a step back to hide in the shadows. John seemed ready to act, but Bill gestured for him to stop. "Quiet," Bill whispered, looking at the shadows flickering on the walls. He knew that if they didn't act precisely and swiftly, their plan would fall apart in an instant. The footsteps grew louder, and within seconds, several people in black suits entered the basement. Bill couldn't see their faces, but he knew they weren't just guards. These were the ones who had been searching for them. Suddenly, one of the men said, "They're not here. We've checked all the rooms." But one of the others, apparently unconvinced, began inspecting the basement more thoroughly. "They won't leave until they find us," said one of the guards. And that's when Bill realized they had to act immediately, or they'd be caught. It was time to make a move. Bill and John exchanged glances. Time was running out. Their chances of escaping were minimal, but they couldn't afford to give up. Bill gestured to John toward the passage leading to another part of the building. "That way," he said. "We're leaving." They quickly started moving toward the exit, but the guards who had entered the basement weren't giving them a choice. One of them noticed movement in the dark corner and shouted, "They're here!" John darted in another direction, hoping Bill would make it out first. Thoughts raced through his mind. Everything they had been through could become meaningless if they didn't escape. "Run, I'll hold them off," John said. Bill froze. He couldn't leave John. "You're not alone, John," Bill shouted, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward the exit doors. They burst out of the basement, but they were being pursued. Bill felt the rising tension as they rushed down the corridors, trying to find cover. All they had left to do was find the exit and avoid falling into the hands of the guards. But as soon as they reached the last door, Bill saw several police officers already blocking their way. Their faces were hidden by masks, but the weapons in their hands were clearly aimed at Bill and John. "Not this," John whispered, realizing that their strength was running out. "This isn't the end," Bill said, gripping his gun firmly. "We'll make it out. We have to." Just as they prepared for the final confrontation, one of the police officers stepped forward and said, "It's not what you think, Maher." Bill froze when he heard those words. He felt his body tense up in surprise. "What do you mean?" he asked, not understanding what was happening. The police officer removed his mask, revealing a familiar face. It was someone Bill had worked with not long ago. Bill was stunned. This man was connected to police corruption, but how had he ended up in this situation? "You thought you'd expose everything? You thought we wouldn't notice you?" the officer said with a smirk. "You've become part of the game. You can't get out." Bill felt his plan crumble. In that moment, he realized that the hidden threat was not where he had expected. His life now depended on what he did in the next second. Bill stood in the empty corridor, his mind racing with thoughts about what had happened over the past few days. All his efforts to expose the criminal network had led him to this point. But there was something more. Keanu Reeves, still an important figure to him. From the very beginning, his arrest had been more than just a coincidence. Why was Keanu at the center of this game? Why had he been arrested so quickly without any apparent reason? These questions haunted Bill, and he knew that the answers were hidden deeper. "We need to understand what happened to him," Bill said, thinking aloud. John, standing next to him, seemed to be deep in thought as well. With each step, Bill was becoming more certain. Keanu Reeves was the key to all of this. He wasn't just an ordinary guest on Bill's show, and his connection to this network could be far deeper than anyone had imagined. John nodded silently. "If you want to figure out what happened to him, we need to go back to the beginning. Remember that night on the show? When everything started?" "Of course," Bill replied, though his voice had grown grim. "But since then, we have no idea where he is. And what if he wasn't just a random victim, and his involvement was part of their plan from the start?" Bill froze, his gaze falling on the old notebook he had pulled from his bag. It was worn, its pages turning stiffly. This was the last trace he had left after Keanu disappeared. If we don't find him, we risk losing everything. With each passing minute of reflection, Bill felt his steps becoming more uncertain. But one thought kept running through his mind. What if Keanu's arrest wasn't just an act of violence or a mistake? Perhaps this was all part of a bigger plan, and his involvement, though seemingly insignificant at first, could have influenced the enormous forces behind it. "We have to go back to his office," Bill said, finally deciding that they needed to go all the way. John sighed but nodded. They both knew that hidden within this place was the key to ending this whole story. Or, conversely, destroying everything they had tried to build. They arrived at Keanu Reeves' office, and Bill felt the tension tightening around him once again. They entered, surveying the space that once belonged to the actor, now left in a half-destroyed state, as if someone had hurriedly left without taking their belongings. The room was empty, with only a few documents on the desk and an old chair where Keanu had once sat. "I don't believe this is all so simple," Bill said, scanning the room. John leaned over the desk and started flipping through the papers. One document caught his attention. It was a list of names, among which he noticed several familiar figures, including police officers and high-profile politicians. All of this was connected to what Bill had been trying to expose. They were all part of the same criminal network. Keanu knew about this. "He was at the center of it," John said, squeezing the piece of paper in his hands. "And probably his arrest was part of this plan. He wasn't just a random victim." Bill felt his heart race. Everything he had suspected was now being confirmed. But now a new question arose. Where was Keanu? And more importantly, was he in danger? But before they could continue, the sound of footsteps echoed from around the corner. Bill quickly turned and his heart tightened. Someone was in the office. When the door opened, a man stood before them, someone Bill hadn't expected to see. It was the same police officer who had orchestrated Keanu's arrest live on air. His face was hidden behind dark glasses, but Bill recognized him immediately. "Do you think you can just walk in here and solve everything?" The officer's voice was threatening, and Bill could feel the tension rising. John was already on alert, his hand resting on the gun tucked under his jacket. "How long did you plan to hide the truth?" Bill asked, trying to mask the nervousness in his voice. "You thought Keanu was just a random victim, but he was part of your plan from the beginning, wasn't he?" The officer silently watched him, but his eyes betrayed the coldness that hid not only fear but also power. He took a step forward. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Maher. This is no longer just your investigations. This is a much bigger assignment. If you want to end this, you will have to pay the price." Bill realized that he and John were trapped. The only question was, could they outsmart him and escape alive, or would they become part of the game? The man continued speaking, and his words fell on Bill and John like heavy stones. He didn't hide the fact that they were in serious danger. Bill knew he needed to be careful with every word. He couldn't afford a mistake. "You, Bill, have learned too much. You should have understood that this won't end. And if you think your efforts will break the system, you're gravely mistaken. We control not just you, but everything around you." Bill stared at him, his mind spinning, trying to grasp what was really going on. He felt his life change with every word, every move. What once seemed like a game was now a deadly risk. "You have no idea what we've built," the man continued. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." At that moment, Bill realized that everything he had fought for would be meaningless unless they destroyed the system from within. And the most important thing now was that everything they knew was in question. Bill felt his heart race faster as the officer finished his speech. He stood before Bill and John, their opponent, representing a powerful force controlling everything happening around them. Everything Bill and John had built, everything they had sacrificed to expose this criminal network, now hung by a thread. And what was happening now had become their last chance to defeat the system. "You know we will defeat you," the police officer continued, his eyes sparkling with menace. "You thought you could just destroy everything so easily. You've learned too much and now you'll have to pay for it." But despite his words, Bill remained calm. Everything he had gone through now seemed like preparation for this moment. He knew they couldn't give up. He also knew that now or never was the time. They were on the edge, and every step they took could be decisive. "You're wrong," Bill said, his voice firm and confident. "You don't understand who you're dealing with. The system you've built won't work forever. We will destroy it, even if it means going to extreme measures." Hearing this, the officer curled his lips into a smirk. "You can try, but they will win anyway. We are not just the police. We are the power." At that moment, Bill noticed a shadow darting from around the corner. It was clear that something bigger was happening than they could have imagined. Something was changing. In that moment, Bill realized they were trapped. Before Bill could take a step, the door they had just entered slammed shut. More men in black suits, heavily armed, surrounded them. They were now part of the system. What had started as a fight for truth was now turning into a battle for survival. "You were too confident that you could escape," the officer said, moving closer to Bill. "Every step you take is under our control. We knew about you, and you will never win." Bill flinched. He knew they needed to act instantly, but his mind was overloaded. Suddenly, he felt a growing sense of anxiety. It seemed that this whole network was far more complex and deeper than they could have ever imagined, and everything they were about to do might only be another step in a game they couldn't win. John, standing nearby, noticed the police were starting to move, blocking their possible escape routes. The moment they were fully surrounded, Bill realized that their chances of escaping were rapidly shrinking. They couldn't rely on anything but sheer willpower and determination. At that moment, as the officers started to close in, Bill made an unguarded step to the side, but his body was seized by two guards who instantly grabbed him. He felt his arms being restrained, his eyes filled with threat and rage. He knew that if they didn't escape now, everything would be lost. But in that moment, John, sensing the pressure of the situation, gathered his remaining strength. He broke free from the guard's grip and fired several shots into the air, drawing attention to himself. Bill managed to break free and, using his speed and agility, grabbed a gun from one of the guards. He was ready for the final fight. "We will not give up," Bill shouted, getting up from the ground. He knew that in their hands was the last chance to stop this network. They had to finish what they started. The skirmish was brutal and quick. Bill and John fought the guards, using everything they had learned over the years of battling the system. Every move was calculated, every punch was precise. There was no room for mistakes in this fight. John fired a few more shots, taking out guards while Bill moved towards the exit. When they finally burst out of the building, they were being chased. Ahead of them, they spotted a tall fence, but it was clear they wouldn't make it in time. Bill was injured, John was exhausted, but they weren't giving up. At that moment, John, slightly out of breath, said, "Do you think we can get out? We'll lose everything if we don't find a way to open this fence." "No doubts," Bill replied. "We can't give up now." As they finally ran out of the building, Bill felt his heart tighten. Someone was on their tail. Keanu Reeves appeared like a ghost from the dark shadows of the past. His face was hidden under a hood, and his eyes, as usual, remained unreadable. Bill and John, just out of the building, stopped in shock when they saw him. "Keanu!" Bill exclaimed, his voice filled with surprise and doubt. Keanu slowly lifted his head and looked at them, as if nothing unusual was happening. He was dressed as usual, in a dark jacket and jeans, but there was something in his gaze that made Bill and John feel that not everything was as simple as it seemed. "Did you think it was all going to end?" Keanu asked, his voice calm but with an underlying tension. "Do you think you can win? It's not that easy." Bill felt his heart flutter with anxiety. What was going on? Why was Keanu back in the game? He was one of those they were trying to protect. But now his appearance seemed to cast new light on everything they had done. Keanu looked at them, and his next question hung in the air like a hidden threat. "Are you sure you want to know the truth?" When Bill and John stepped aside to talk with Keanu, the tension was palpable. It felt like more than just a pause. This was the moment when two worlds, Bill and John's world of trying to expose corruption and Keanu's world full of secrets and uncertainty, collided. "What are you doing here?" John asked, not hiding his suspicions. "You were involved in this, weren't you?" Keanu slowly removed his hood, and his face was revealed in the dim light, like a mirror reflecting everything that had happened before. "I wasn't part of the plan, John," he replied calmly, "but I became part of something much bigger." "You speak like someone who knows more than they're letting on," Bill said, his voice tense. "You were with us. Then you disappeared, and now you're back." Keanu nodded silently. "I was forced to leave, but now I need to be with you. All of this is part of the system that controls us. I can't hide anymore." But before they could continue their conversation, the sound of footsteps echoed from the street. A group of people in black suits, heavily armed, appeared in front of them. As the group approached, Keanu felt his heart skip a beat. He knew these people. They weren't just random guards. They were agents he had been avoiding for a long time. They weren't ordinary police. This was a special unit, and their actions had always stayed in the shadows. They worked for those who stood behind all of this. "You've probably already figured out that you can't escape," said one of the guards. But Keanu, you decided to come back? This is no longer your game. Do you think you can stop me? Keanu said with such confidence that Bill and John noticed the guards hesitate for a moment. One of the guards approached Keanu, but Bill noticed something strange. He hadn't expected it to be this easy. Could it be that Keanu was back in the game? A game where his life was at risk, but at the same time he was part of the very system they were trying to destroy. Are you still on their side? John asked, his voice sharp and full of discontent. I'm on no one's side, Keanu replied, slightly smiling. I'm playing by my own rules now. In that moment, Keanu moved quickly and struck the first guard, sending him to the ground as if there was no danger at all. It was incredibly fast, and Bill and John barely managed to understand what was happening. Keanu continued to act with lightning speed, and Bill and John couldn't help but be stunned. It wasn't a coincidence. Keanu knew what he was doing, and his actions were precise. He was part of this game, and now he had to make sure they all made it out alive. If you don't want this to continue, you need to leave, Keanu said, his gaze hard and his movements determined. Now's not the time for talking. We need to move before it's too late. Together, they moved forward, each step bringing them closer to the heart of the network. Keanu seemed to be the one who knew all the routes. He led them through narrow alleyways, hiding from those on their tail. Bill and John followed him, but now they realized that the game had changed. Keanu wasn't just their ally, he was the key to breaking it all down. But suddenly, something appeared in their way that Keanu hadn't anticipated. It was the moment when his own fears and secrets became his greatest threat. And now, they had to face what had been hidden behind that long silence. As they approached the building that, according to Keanu, should be the place where they would finally break the chains of corruption, the tension was rising. Bill and John began to realize that they were playing a game with rules they didn't fully understand. Keanu had once again found himself at the center of this struggle. We can't lose this, Keanu said, his voice tense. If we don't expose them now, we'll lose everything. Bill felt his heart tighten. Everything they had been through had led them here. Keanu wasn't just an actor in this story, he was part of it in the most unexpected way. Let's do this, said John, and all three entered the building, which could be their last chance for victory. But as soon as the door closed behind them, they realized that every step they took was now being watched by forces they couldn't predict. And now, they would have to fight not just for their lives, but for the truth that could destroy everything. Keanu Reeves had found himself at the center of the most dangerous game of his life. But now the question was not only whether they could beat the system, the question was whether they could expose the truth despite all the obstacles ahead. The time had come. Keanu Reeves stood before the camera, his face unreadable and his gaze determined. The noise around them, studio audiences waiting for the beginning of the most epic show, promised something greater than just entertainment. But this time it was not just a show, it was a revelation. Keanu sighed, feeling the tension in the air rise. He was ready to tell the whole truth, despite all the threats and dangers that had surrounded him over the past few weeks. This was not just his decision. It was something he had to do to put an end to the system that had corrupted everything around him. He walked onto the stage, and the audience began to applaud, unaware of what would come next. Keanu looked as though his calmness only heightened the sense of an impending storm. Bill Maher stood next to him, giving a restrained smile, but his gaze spoke volumes. It all started here, and now it had to end. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Keanu said, his voice calm but with a heavy undertone. Tonight, on this show, I will tell you something more than just a script. This will be something real. The audience froze and the studio fell silent. Keanu paused, then his next words turned everything upside down. Everything you thought about my life was a lie, Keanu began, never breaking his gaze from the camera. He felt his heart pounding in his chest, but he was ready to speak. Everything that has happened in the past few months was part of a much darker picture, a picture I had no idea about when I first entered this game. The audience began to realize this was not going to be an ordinary broadcast. Keanu spoke about how he had found himself at the center of a criminal network run by high-profile officials and police officers who used their power to control everything, from illegal dealings to the lives of ordinary people. But here's the important part, he continued. I wasn't just an actor in their story. I became the one who destroyed it. And I did it because I knew that if I didn't, someone else would stay in their shadow. A picture flashed on the screen, images of documents and videos they had collected with Bill and John during the investigation. This was what they had to show the world. The screen displayed evidence, personal correspondences, financial reports, photographs proving the ties between the police and criminals. Everything you see in front of you, Keanu said, pointing to the photos showing high-profile figures and their connections with criminal organizations, is evidence. These are not just words. This is the threat we all didn't realize. Bill Maher, standing beside him, raised his hand, signaling that he was ready to support Keanu. You are not just seeing the results of an investigation. You are seeing how one person can bring down a system that has been destroying other lives for decades. This won't be easy, Keanu said, his voice becoming more determined. But if you want this story to be over, we have to stop them before it's too late. At that moment, several people emerged from behind the studio curtains, eyeing the screen with suspicion. These were the people who did not want the truth to come out. There was something in their eyes that could be interpreted as a threat. Keanu realized that the show was not only gaining viewers, but also adversaries. He knew that at this point he would have to make a choice. He could walk away, but he was already too deeply involved. That night, they were exposing not only the criminals, but the entire system that had been tearing society apart. Today, Keanu said, not only will the system get its answer, we all will. Because we are not afraid to stand against power. We will expose these people and you will judge them by their deeds. But at that very moment, the studio began to tremble. Keanu felt the walls start to close in. This was just the beginning. Behind the scenes, new moves were already being prepared. As Keanu and Bill stepped away from the camera, they felt the attention of not only the audience, but also hidden forces starting to focus on them. This wasn't just an exposure, it was a moment that could change their lives forever. This is just the beginning, Keanu said as they left the studio. There was a fire burning in his eyes that wouldn't go out. It doesn't matter what happens next. We took a step toward the truth, and now that truth will live. Bill was with him, but he too understood that everything they had done could lead to consequences. They were ready for it, but they knew that there was still one final step to take, in the face of the entire system. We've exposed them, Keanu, Bill said, but now it's important how we live after this. We'll become an example for everyone. At that moment, they turned around and the lights in the studio went out. On the screen, only the shadow of their faces remained. The system had collapsed, but the cost of victory was still unclear. Keanu and Bill stood in the dark studio, realizing that they had done everything they could. But the finale was only the beginning. What would happen to them next, and whether they could survive the consequences, remained unknown.